Okay, so we're going to talk today about trust frameworks and how they may, or what we have in velocity at the moment. Okay, so to orient ourselves in this conversation, we need to kind of think about the problem of trust in the way the data exchange happens. In a typical data exchange that happens at the moment, for example, which is the two-party model, we just have like the issuer and relying party. Um, so the issuer, whoever they happen to be, will provide data directly to a relying party, um, but the individual's not involved, right? So the while the problem of trust is actually pretty straightforward in that as long as the relying party trusts the issuer and they have a direct peer-to-peer or one-to-one relationship with each other, why would I enter into a one-to-one relationship with an organization I don't trust? The individual is completely disempowered in this, the way that data is being handled at the moment, right? In fact, many of these flows are unethical, for example, data mining and so on. Effectively, there's no or very little individual privacy. There's very little laws that are related to these sorts of interactions. So, of course, we want to use the three-party model where an individual gets a wallet and is able to use that wallet to obtain and manage their own credentials. So they become empowered in this new model and are able to then share it to a myriad of relying parties. We break apart these um, one-to-one interactions and they use the wallet to enable actually many relying parties to receive the same information at much lower cost because they don't need to build these individual interactions with each single issuer anymore. But we introduce problems of trust and, as we'll see, problems of privacy by doing this, or new problems of privacy. Um, in particular, the relying party needs to trust the wallet and the individual that's presenting that data to them and the issuers. So in the end, the issuers, and they no longer have this one-to-one relationship with the issuer. It's now a myriad of different issuers out there, and it's unreasonable for the relying party um, to have a direct relationship, direct legal relationship with that issuer. Instead, that legal relationship, as you guys know, is with the ecosystem, with the foundation itself. So the question becomes, right, what we're showing here is why would, if I've got trust problems, if we've introduced, two levels of trust problems and the issue that used to be between the relying party and issuer, which was quite simple because I'd already entered into a legal relationship when I decided to accept data from that issuer, no longer exists. So we have a much more complex trust problem here because there's no direct relationship existing between relying party and issuer anymore. Okay, so how can a relying party trust the credential being presented by an individual holder? Right, that's really the question we're trying to answer, and we know kind of the answer to this. I think these are the credential checks that Velocity does. And most, it's nothing unique about what Velocity is doing, but perhaps in the way it approaches these problems is unique, right? So, um, of course, the credential should not be tampered with, and we use cryptographic signatures to do that. There's a whole bunch of features that signature solution should have that are listed here. Like you want to use asymmetric crypto, and you uh, want to decentralize the verifiability of those credentials so there's no phone home as part of that digital signature checking. Um, and You want crypto agility, right? You want to be able to switch algorithms as new algorithms come along. And you also want to make sure it's secure, right? If it's not secure, the whole game is up. And so as a result, Velocity Network decided to use pretty much standard what are called ECDSA signatures with JWTs because it's a very well known and understood, but also provides that security and agility that we need. You've got to make sure, obviously, that the data is relevant and valid. Otherwise, I'm not going to trust the data contained within. So thinking, for example, a license needs to have an expiry date. Otherwise, I'm not going to trust this. Even if it has a license number on there, it's not an incomplete data set, right? And so those elements need to be there. And of course, Lossy Network has defined a number of layer one credential types to cover the core HR use cases to make sure that all data is there and valid, and therefore that the credential can be trusted as part, or the credential types can be trusted by the relying parties. All right, so fine, they've got expiry dates and the license isn't expired, but we need to also make sure that the source of this credential is the originally intended recipient. And there's two main problems here that need to be solved. One, the credentials could be stolen from the holder's wallet and put into another person's wallet. Or secondly, there was impersonation of the intended recipient when the issuing was done, the original issuing. So if we look at our little diagram here, yeah. So here we're saying, well, the credentials in theory could be stolen from this wallet. This is the concern the relying party should have, and also when this issuing step was happening, that well, I thought it was going to Sally, but in the end, it actually went to Bob, right? And because this mechanism here to the issuer was not strong enough, the way that Sally was authenticated was not strong enough, and so these two problems are quite difficult to solve, I would say. The first, so the stolen credentials one, typically you're either phoning home, which we don't want to do because then we're just back at the original situation where individuals' privacies are being broken. And of course, Velocity Network, its core use case, almost like the North Star use case, is like, oh, I want to be able to apply for jobs without my current employer knowing anything about it. So phone home is just not possible in our use case, and so you're usually trading off complexity of the solution to risk of correlation. Risk of correlation is a term used in the industry. Basically, it basically means your privacy is being broken. What it means is like if I receive your data, I will be able to over multiple instances, like multiple disclosures. I'll be able to correlate each of those together and form a profile of you, right? Because first I got your driver's license, and then I got your education degree, and I was able to correlate those things. Now, often there are certainly use cases where that's important. For example, government interactions. I think that would be an important thing. In the recruitment use cases that we're typically talking about, correlation is unavoidable. And so we probably take and typically our disclosures typically involve multiple credentials, which is not the general case that privacy professionals are thinking of when they point out the correlatability problem. So we tend to take a less strict issue with correlation on Velocity Network as a result. The second issue, which is like related to impersonation and that the wrong individual receiving the credential in the first place, does require, certificate effectively requires some sort of certification or at least audit log of the authentication protocols. Um, and it's certainly a significant part of EU EIDAS. So here I'm talking about other foundations or other groups that are building ecosystems or technology. So EU EIDAS is the EU's digital credentialing um, framework that they're trying to introduce in the EU. And OpenID Foundation also is looking at this issue around providing audit logs effectively around how authentication took place. And that's not dissimilar really to Satish's idea from back in the day, or mine and his, I can't remember where it came from, but about using the evidence section to describe how um, a credential was decided to be issued to an individual by using the evidence section of verifiable credentials. So, look, needless to say, this second issue, we don't have a solution just yet for it, but it is something that ecosystems can and will help to solve. The first issue, and it could be a combination of those two. So, certification of authentication protocols and auditing how or providing audit logs of how authentication took place for relying parties to evaluate. And then the first one, we definitely use personal data binding using keys to bind in. We also put in the recipient's name. And this is like personal data binding into the credentials. And so we use those techniques currently to mitigate these issues, but I wouldn't say they're 100% solved, but they're pretty, it's pretty strong, and we continue to work in this area. Okay, so how do we make sure the credential has the next thing is we need to make sure the status of the credential, and typically that's revoked status. There's also, in theory, we don't really have it just yet, but suspension statuses. Um, we will need this when licenses become more commonly issued on Velocity Network as well. So you have these two statuses, typically revocation and suspension, that's being talked about. Typically, this is done via some sort of what are called bit strings in the verifiable credentials world. There are other ways to do revocation, but these bit strings have been found to be, pretty good for privacy preserving reasons, and they're very small storage. Um, they contain no reference back to the original credential. They are just a bit is just a 0 or 1. So when the 1 is on, the thing is revoked, and if it's 0, then it's not. It's just a simple true or false. Um, Now the problem here is less. I mean, the trust element is quite straightforward. These bit strings solve it. The problem here, of course, is that it opens up an exploitation around privacy. The most of the um, solutions that the W3C based standard effectively pushes towards, and that is that the data, these bit strings, are stored by the issuer themselves, and so it creates this interaction with the original issuer that is exploitable. The spec obviously is trying to avoid that exploitability, um, but because the protocol ends up with a phone home, it is exploitable by issuers, particularly ones that uh, use the protocols in bad faith. And so it's very possible to add in to do pixel tracking via the current architecture that's typically being used by most, let's say that those that follow the specs faithfully. Um, so we don't do that. We put ours on our decentralized ledger, um, and it avoids that particular loophole. And secondly, there's another problem, which is that the issuers can disappear, right? Why would an issuer disappear? Well, they might go bankrupt or they might merge with another organization. And so in those cases, sometimes that brand will disappear, right? Particularly in the bankruptcy case, that company will be no longer, or if they're insolvent, right? That company will no longer have a website, and then poof, the revocation status is completely gone, and therefore these credentials can no longer be trusted. Um, and and so Velocity tries to handle this use case again by storing them on a decentralized ledger, which basically is an immutable data storage, as we all know, right? And so what this means is that there's this concept of survivability of Velocity network credentials that typically doesn't exist in, again, those ones that follow the spec um, um, uh, to store these bit strings on issuer websites. Okay, and then lastly, and probably even um, and we try and address this issue, the problem of the reputable issuer, and we require Velocity Network requires that the issuer um, can meet these kind of five steps that are listed here. Um, so the five steps basically come down to the following, right? Which is, can I get keys for this? The public keys needed to verify digital signatures. Can I get them from the credential to the original issuer? Once I have that issuer's ID, can I find them on Velocity Network on the registrar? Are they accredited to use a particular credential type? Um, and in the case that the the issuer is what we call a primary source for the credential type, i.e., is it the actual employer? Is it my employer, Velocity Career Labs? Um, if they are the credential issuer, then the authoritative institution on that credential or the primary organization should be Velocity Career Labs. It shouldn't be anything else. And so we're actually the fourth step here is checking something that's important in Velocity Network because we've introduced what we call notaries, right? Notaries are organizations that can issue for any organization. Why? Because they are a background screener and they have rigorous processes and are accredited by the network. So this kind of set of elaborated issuer checks is really quite unique to Velocity Network. It's unique to the fact that Velocity Network is trying to build the biggest set of credentials at an ecosystem level for across the globe, and enabling these notary issuer style use cases, which most other ecosystems are not thinking about. Um, and so that's the having to address these problems makes Velocity Network quite unique in the trust problems that it's trying to solve, and also the comprehensive solutions that are being brought. Um, Again, survivability of all these queries is incredibly important. And so most of this information is stored on chain. By survivability, right, I'm referring again to the problem of issuers becoming insolvent or being acquired. So all this information is available on chain, and therefore, even if that organization no longer exists, the original issuer doesn't exist, I can still perform all these checks and know that the credential was valid. Okay, so we've got, through this process, we can see that um, we're able to solve most of the relying parties' problems um, in whole, and in one case, at the moment, I would say perhaps in part, and that's where we have a little bit of work to do. Um, um, Around trust and while preserving privacy, i.e., without any phone home, even though there's a big arrow going back to the issue, we haven't actually needed to phone home because we've utilized the distributed ledger to avoid all phone home issues down the bottom there. And additionally, the distributed ledger has given us survivability, right? The credentials are still able to be issued, even if this issuer doesn't even exist anymore.
Can I add
Yeah,
one thing that isn't it's
yeah,
not a technical thing, it's a legal thing, but I think it's part, in my view, also of the trust of the relying party in the issuer, and that is the legal framework that every issuer signs, so that the relying party knows that there's liability by the issuer. Not only does it know that that issuer is who it claims to be and has the right to issue the type of credential, but that it's signed the Velocity Network terms and conditions to in order to participate and be an issuer, and therefore has if the organization still exists, has liability for the credentials it issues. That's really critical in industries where a relying party, for instance, a hospital may uh, hire a nurse based on a credential of employment or education or license that she's presented, and it turns out someone made a mistake. It doesn't even have to be a mistake. And something someone made any fraud. Someone made a mistake, and the hospital is still sued. It needs to know what throat it can choke, and who it can go back and sue for the mistake that was made, not their fault. And that, in this case, is the issuer that issued that information. The legal framework protects the relying parties and creates clear liability on the issuers, which is again part, I think, of the trust that the Velocity Network provides.
absolutely. Deb,
Thank you. This is really helpful. Before you go on to the next section, can you please go back to that slide you were just on that has accreditation? And Tom, I think you partly just explained this, but can you please provide a little more information about what accreditation means in this context?
sure. But this is the slide you wanted me to.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Sure. Absolutely. So, in Velocity Network, accreditation, when an issuer comes on board, or any organization comes on board, this is irrelevant of the role that you're taking on board in Velocity Network, taking on in within Velocity Network. You undergo a know your business check. You've agreed to legal terms, and then additionally, as an entity, when you're signing up, you'll add particular services to Velocity Network that you're looking to provide on the network. So that could be an issuer, as in this case that we're focusing on here, but it could be others like I want to be a relying party to receive credentials, or I want to be a wallet provider, etc. Um, at that point in time, that there is a review done by the Velocity Network to see if you meet the criteria for those particular services you want to provide. And in particular, there are a couple of services that we really that the board has given particular instruction around of how to accredit those or to review those applications. So, for example, if you want to issue email or phone credentials and you are not the original email or phone provider, or if you would like to do the same for career credentials, so i.e. if you're a background screener, and similarly if you're doing identity documents. So effectively if you're an ID verifier. So there's particular accreditation requirements or sorry, certification requirements that you're expected to present as part of that approval process. Once you're approved, Velocity Network will accredit you. And that accreditation is done via a verifiable credential. And in that the Velocity Network will issue to the entity a verifiable credential. That entity can then store it on their website, or it is also stored at the registrar to provide a convenient source and backup source for that information. If you know, again, for that survivability criteria that we have, and those accreditations basically outline the credential types or the permissions that you have on the network, or that an entity has on the network. Are they allowed to issue career credentials, identity credentials? Are they expected to be, as I said, the primary organization? That's step 4. So the fine grained permission is encoded, or permissions are encoded in that accreditation verifiable credential.